Now,
Did these people really like take Hermes Trismegistus and move him back in time? Did they like not worry about the fact that he lived 2,500 years after Moses?
Hermes
Or did they-
Trismegistus didn't ever live.
Okay, well, it said there's around 640.
Well, but that was just a painting, that was what they said.
Okay, well, whoever this guy was, he had to live at a certain time.
No, he wasn't a guy. He's a deity. He's Thoth. He's the Egyptian Thoth, who was then related later on in the Hellenistic period to Hermes, the grand Hermes, and then eventually called Hermes thrice greatest. He was not ever a human being any more than Zeus was a human being or Hermes was a human being. But in Egyptian thought, and especially the Hellenistic period, there were two people who were the givers and bringers of science to the Egyptians. Of course, originally was Isis, who is the one who brought knowledge of harvesting grain and things like this. But Hermes Trismegistus was the one who brought the knowledge of astrology, etc. This was not a real person. This was a deity whose name was conflated between Greek and Egyptian deities. Thoth Hermes is what he's called sometimes. So he's not a real person at all, but he's real to those people because they think that they think of him as a real historical person. Now, the creation of Thoth Hermes or of Hermes Trismegistus, first it's Thoth Hermes, probably about the 5th century, 4th century BC. You hear about that, and then finally Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, is totally written about in Greek in Egypt, which is now using Greek as its language, and that's 2nd century, 1st century type of period where you find that name being used. But so it's associated with a whole system of thought that developed from the Egyptian priesthood. The Egyptian priests I have a whole course on this and I can't do the whole thing here, but basically the Egyptian priests had specialized in all kinds of sciences, from dressing and undressing the gods and parading them around like we talked about here they do in India, they were the stolismai and all these different people, to astrology and pharmacology and the science of building buildings and all kinds of other things. All these were priestly sciences, and they were all part of they were put together in what were called the books of Thoth Hermes, and they were carried in great processions. Clement of Alexandria describes one of these processions of the priests carrying their books. It's all the priestly knowledge, which is the scientific knowledge of the Egyptians, and that's what the Hermetic sciences are. But it's actually not just Egyptian. It comes in from the Greeks. It comes in from other sources as well. It's a great compendium of knowledge you might have found at the Library of Alexandria or something like that on all these things. So that's what it was historically. To the Christians, though, to these people in the medieval period, Hermes Trismegistus was a great sage, and he was like Moses. And in the 1st century, 2nd century, if you're going to read this book, that's my dissertation on Hermes Trismegistus and the initiation tractate of the Hermetic corpus and so on, of the cult of Hermes Trismegistus, the actual historical cult that existed in the 1st century and the 2nd century, you'll find quotations from Christian fathers who considered Hermes Trismegistus to be equivalent to the Holy Spirit. It was the only pagan deity that was given great respect by the early Christian fathers, and all the rest of them were all satanic and demonic, but Hermes Trismegistus was a great being. He was basically considered to be the Holy Spirit coming to the Egyptians or something like that.
I've read some places that Hermes was attributed, just as was attributed coming from an Atlantean origin. He was one of the philosophers or something that survived the sinking.
Are you thinking of Shepherd of Hermes?
No.
No, he's talking about Hermes Trismegistus, yeah.
That too. Okay.
Yeah.
They got the wisdom from that.
That's not a classical source. I mean, Plato's the one who talks about Atlantis. but he doesn't talk about Hermes Trismegistus coming from Atlantis. That's later, metaphysical people from the 19th century or something. I might have said that. So, what happens as the Hermetic ideas are applied and the Hermetic philosophy is becomes so seductive because it's a way of putting the whole world together and the universe together and human beings together in a system that all really makes sense, and it can work with Christianity very well, and with Kabbalah and everything else. It becomes a subject of sacred art. And we're going to look at Botticelli. Like many artists of his time, he was trained in the Pythagorean and Hermetic ideas of what images would do. Now, you might remember from the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity that idolatry, which is a very negative term in Christianity and especially among Protestants, means literally the veneration of images. And that is not that was the way that human beings connected themselves with the divine in the ancient world. It still is the way that people do it in places like India, but it's not that they think that the god is the idol or the image. I mean, they'll take the image and destroy it after it's been used in a ceremony. But the image reflects something much greater that makes itself present through this image. And among the ancient Greeks, the better an image of Zeus you could make, the closer you were to Zeusness. And here the idea was that the better an image you could make of the divine potencies in the skies, and here we're talking about astrological images. The bad guys are Saturn, and the good guys are like Venus and Jupiter and so on. Bad guys, Mars and so on. You want to bring the good energies into a house. So art becomes talismanic. It becomes something that you use to actually reflect and channel those energies, the energies of good fortune, good luck, and expansion and prosperity into your home. And wealthy people would hire artists to paint paintings that would do that. And the paintings would have allegorically embedded in them these ideas. So here we have a painting of Botticelli. Does anybody know what this is? That's Venus, yeah, Aphrodite. She's called the foam born. She's born from the foam of the sea. So images like this were made that had inscribed into them. You couldn't tell. It just looks like somebody's in the middle and somebody's standing in a seashell, because she's Aphrodite, and and so on. And here are zephyrs and winds blowing and so on. But in fact, embedded into this are not only astrological symbolism that will bless a home or bless the place that it goes into, but other kinds of talismanic imagery that are, for example, Pythagorean harmonia, Pythagorean harmony, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So you can bring these things through proportion, direction, mythological function, and mathematical position by images of elemental forces, forces of nature, that confer these powers, because as above, so below. So here are elemental forces, zephyrs, winds, that south winds that confer fecundity and things that are positive, the increase and the growth of spring and so on. Now this is perhaps one of the most esoteric Hermetic images ever made, the image of primavera. This is what it looks like, a bunch of people standing around holding their arms in funny positions and stuff like that, but built into it, if you're an art critic or if you are an art historian, you know what's in these because you've read the descriptions of them written at the time and what they're supposed to be. We have to understand first, to understand primavera, we have to understand the Hermetic Pythagorean concept of the harmony of the spheres. Now, this is a nice diagram to use. What's all this? Well, up at the top we have Apollo. We have Thalia, who represents prosperity. And now we have a bunch of interesting names of nymph-type creatures here associated with names that have to do with the modes of music, Mixolydian and Phrygian and so on, associated with planets. And so what is this all representing? What's going on here? This is one representation of the unity of things, how the harmony of the spheres, how this all relates. It was the imagery of the Renaissance was not just biblical; it was steeped in Greek mythology and biblical legend altogether. If you read Shakespeare, you have to know Greek mythology to understand what he's talking about. So it's a synthesis of both the Greek and the Christian. Here we have celestial spheres coordinated with the 9 muses of Greek mythology. Now these are the 9 muses, Calliope and so on. For example, Euterpe is attributed to Jupiter. Here's Euterpe. Here's Jupiter. Apollo, which is the sun, is the deity of prophecy, as he was in in Greece. The priests of Apollo took over what was originally an oracle of Gaia, and it became known as the Oracle at Delphi. And Apollo was associated with music and prophecy, and so he's associated still this way. So he sits on a throne up here. He's the sun, and he represents also the Holy Spirit. Thalia up at the top and at the bottom represents the idea of prospering. So the way this is drawn is to show prosperity, is to create prosperity. It's a talisman to create prosperity through Hermetic Pythagorean harmonia. Now the mother of the Corybantes, who was an ecstatic female, these were the female devotees of Dionysius, is Thalia, and she was also the representation of prosperity. And then the musical modes themselves are connected to the 7 planets and the 8 zodiacal spheres on the right over here, like the Dorian and so on. And the poetic meters are all connected to the muses on the left. These are all meters of poetry. So all this is a way of, if you're going to write a poem, you're going to know, you're not going to just make something rhyme or something. The meter that you write it in, even the day you compose it on, and the hour that you choose to read it for the first time, and all kinds of things are going to be related, and they all have to be understood. This is the principle of the harmony of the spheres, that all things are connected in this kind of. So, I'm going to quote to you from a scholar named Dempsey's his critical essay called "The Portrayal of Love" about the Primavera and humanist culture at that time. And so I'm going to make one little note before we go into this, that the scale that we use of music, the tempered scale, da 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 da, is not mathematically pure by Pythagorean rules. In all musical scales, whether they're Chinese or Hindu or and European, 1 octave is a bit less than double the math of the other one. For example, if you have an A440, we don't have A880 as our next octave. We have like A875 or something. It's a little flat. And that was something that people were well aware of. Pythagoras worked with strings and precise measurements of proportions. And he found that, if you wanted to make an instrument that sounded good to human ears, you had to make it the way we all do. You put in stops in a certain place, but the octaves are not perfect. The octaves are imperfect. They go a little flat as you go up. In THG, when we do an attunement before our Wesak initiation, we use perfect Pythagorean octaves on the attunement tape, so it sounds like it gets going sharper and sharper as we go up, and it kind of grinds and grates away at you. But in fact, that's because we're subjecting ourselves to perfection, which you don't do too well when you stand in front of a burning bush too long, this sort of thing. So this is the thing I wanted to note. Now here's what Dempsey tells us about this. He says that the Pythagoreans proposed that for evolutionary or intelligent octaves to have a fully harmonious ring to them, in other words, for them to be correct. Let me fix that door because it's just banging.
What do you want me to do?
Well, so it's not going to go slamming shut, just maybe close it would be okay, or just put the chair in the way. It's necessary to exceed the bounds of ordinary practical music and actually introduce additional concentrations of resonance at the points of vibrational retardation between the notes mi to fa and ti to do. In other words, we're going to have to actually raise the pitch a little bit in order to make it work. So these additionally, he calls them concentrations of resonances or metaphysical semitones, will be created in time by the individual himself. Now, if you have a painting like Primavera that can help you do that, then in a way that seems proportional and harmonious, that's even better. So the 7-tone octave of practical music reflects a natural cosmic process which is in fact disharmonious. Without the 2 additional semitones that you have to put into it to goose it up to make it a full octave, it's not possible for a developing scale of intelligent resonance to exactly double its rate of vibrations. You can't have an octave, a musical octave goes from 440 to 880, and therefore square its possibilities, because mathematically when you do that, you square its possibilities. So in lacking the aforementioned semitones, the natural living octave must given time either decompose, which the Pythagoreans called something would involve, or be deflected or consumed by other more powerful orders of energy and form passing through its given sphere of influence. And so we have a vast multiplicity of natural forms existing in the universe, and there are no apparent straight lines in nature, etc. So here's what here's what the people that were very steeped and versed in this sort of thing did. They made a painting that would correct this. It would give us the correct harmony of the spheres. It would give us the correct harmony of the octave, but they do it in a visual. So here's Primavera. This is, these are the characters we have: Zephyr, Chorus, and Flora, Venus, representing pleasure, chastity, beauty, and Mercury is over here. Well, here's what it would do naturally, left by itself. It needs a semitone here, it needs a semitone here, or it's going to degrade. It's going to go back into the natural form. We want it to form a straight line for a perfect octave, but we're talking about it as a visual thing here, graphic thing. So we're going to, in order to create this, we're going to introduce graphically a semitone here and a semitone there. And that is how the painting was corrected and made. Now, this is not somebody's later interpretation. This is the intention of the artist, and this is what you will read documents about and papers and diaries about, etc. So basically, the painting as it was made, where people are positioned and why one is positioned higher than another and so on, and why their heads are positioned in positions they are in, is to create that particular thing. Here's a semitone here. This is what is done with that semitone here and so on, to create the perfected octave, so to speak. So these were complex Hermetic compositions. They used, as I say, Kabbalistic horary astrology and magical sigils that made medicines and talismans and other magical devices, and Hermetic painters were the Renaissance equivalent of the Greek sculptors who created dynamic images of the gods to make contact with their energies in worship. And that's why they were not just people who could make pretty pictures. They were people who were technicians of the sacred, so to speak. So this is what was going on during the time of the Hermetic Renaissance. Very profound stuff. One of the great people who of the 15th century and the 16th was Paracelsus, who had the name Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim.
No wonder they call him Paracelsus.
Yes, he called himself Paracelsus, actually, because it was common for people to take Latin names. You find that even among the Masonic writers and things like that, they give themselves names like that. This man was an innovator in medical things and medical pharmacology, but as basically as an alchemist, as a medical alchemist. In his day, medical doctors were people who were scholars that were trained in colleges to diagnose from a distance. They would send if you were sick, he would send his assistant out to you, and he'd ask you some questions, and he'd go back, and then he would tell his assistant, okay, go over to the pharmacologist and have him mix this stuff up. He'd look in books and find it. And then the assistant would come back and he'd say, now go administer this drug to these people. He'd never even see the patient. Sort of like modern doctors, you know.
Internet medicine.
He came up with a theory that we call vitalism, which we, in fact, in Home Temple have adopted as our theory of health. Because with IRS forced us to have some kind of theology or philosophy as for religious things, so we decided vitalism would be it, plus our code of ethics. You can read our statement of vitalistic stuff on the web if you want. And this Hermetic vitalism that he created was perpetuated in German Rosicrucianism and Illuminism and homeopathy and medical stuff afterwards. He, like many of the people who became great adepts, was a wanderer in his youth. He wandered from teacher to teacher, starting at age 14, and he attended medical school. He rejected the classic role of the physician as a scholar and the archaism of what were called the Galenist. It was Galen and the whole system of medicine that was based on herbs only, plant-based medication. In fact, one of the great things that he invented was a cure for syphilis that's still used today based on mercury. So he did not see the physician as an academician, but as a healer. And as I told you, it was actually the assistant who saw the patient in those days and the apothecary who made the remedy. But he went out and he spent his time with the sick. He became famous and brilliant healer, and he treated the poor without charge. Now, you might recall that in the next century, if you know anything about Rosicrucianism, Christian Rosenkreutz trained people to become healers and to go out and live anonymously and without anybody knowing who they were, and to travel as healers and heal the people for free, etc. In other words, it sounds very much like what he was doing. There are more people in him that were doing things like this. So he made a lot of enemies of the medical establishment, and he actually was forced at one time to go into hiding. And then when he came out, he had a lot of students. So he developed medicine based on alchemical and mineral processes. For example, I mentioned the mercury tincture, which was put in the eyes of babies born to syphilitic mothers, and it saved their vision. They didn't die, and it's actually still used today. And he developed the relationship of the physician to the patient for diagnosis. Bedside manner, sitting with a patient, talking with him. And not only that, he personally made all his own remedies. He wouldn't have somebody else do it. And of course he did it at the correct astrological time. He picked the plants on the full moon. He did all the things he had to do that way if he did it with plants and so on. And he left many writings. And they're accessible to us. And he may have been the model for the historical model for the legendary Christian Rosenkreutz that we will talk about in the next module.
And he's the one who said, to be a physician, you have to be an astrologer.
Yes.
You can't do healing.
Well, the Galenists were all astrologers. They had to, but they weren't as good, anywhere near as advanced in astrology. They just followed a cut and dried little recipe. So I want to contrast the vitalists versus the scholastics. The Galenists are the scholars, the medical doctors were scholars, and the Hermetics and the followers of Paracelsus were healers. Very different, big difference. The others performed analysis. These people performed diagnosis, and they did it in person. And by taking all kinds of observations, not just from hearing a couple of things secondhand from some assistant who may have been a lousy observer of things. They used a shotgun approach. They said, okay, well, this might work, so just give them a pill made of all this stuff. It's sort of
like my doctor does.
yeah, it's sort of like a homeopathic people today who, or you can go down the store and buy a homeopathic remedy made of 14 things. Yeah, combination remedies and things like that. If the one doesn't work, maybe the other one will work, type of thing, and all that kind of stuff. But the only thing I've ever taken as a combination remedy does me any good is xylococcinum. I think it's not a Oh, so I've never taken one that's done me any good then.
You've never taken combination?
I never
period.
My wife would never let me take a combination remedy. She being a Paracelsian. They used single remedies, and it was they understood very exactly what the remedy was for and how it would go and what it was to do. The medical doctors of that age were prescribers of things. These people were chemists. They were their own, apothecaries.
Are you spelling it that way on purpose?
Yeah, that's the way it was spelled. And in fact, if you go to Australia or England, you'll find it spelled that way too, in a lot of shops and things. That's what go to a druggist, you'll find that you're going to a chemist. And they believed only in what we call the animal soul, the vital animal soul, and they could only be addressed by herbal remedies from plants. And he believed in the soul and in the human soul as a microcosm that had animal, vegetable, and mineral aspects to it, as we teach in THG and so on. They had a mechanistic view of how the body worked, very much like modern doctors do. He had a holistic view of how the body worked. It was connected with the spirit and with the emotions, with many other kinds of things. These were followers of Aristotle. Aristotle did not believe there were really any universals, any a real world, a world of the ideal, etc., a divine world in that kind of a sense. These people were realists. That was they were followers of Plato's ideas, as all of the Hermetic ideas were. Van Helmont was a Flemish nobleman who lived a little bit after Paracelsus, and he developed observation and experiment and thought that was far superior to just theory for how things ought to work. So he actually did experiments. Hey, here's a picture of one of his experiments. He found out, well, if you do this, plant grows real well. If you don't do this, it doesn't. He experimented. He did, and the French word for experiment is expérience. And he was strongly influenced by Paracelsus, and he rejected Galenist medicine and the four humors theory and all that sort of thing. He didn't agree entirely with Paracelsus, but he defined Paracelsian vitalism in a way that it became very useful. He was put under house arrest by the Roman Inquisition for these heretical ideas, and he died in 1644. His idea was that there was an archeus, a first thing, which he called a life principle of the anima mundi, which is Paracelsus' term. So it was the world soul, the soul of the world. It was a macrocosm, microcosm kind of idea. It was located in the spleen and could both cause disease and cure disease. So he felt that the causes of diseases and the cure to diseases were very related. This became very important later in homeopathy, a couple centuries later. And his idea was that there were seeds of subtle spiritual energy that were images of diseases that could be transmitted and proceeded from spirit into matter. This is a little different than just evil spirits that take over you. What is that comparable to in Hahnemann's thought in homeopathy? Is there something like that?
Yeah, kind of just morbific influences on the vital force.
And he also did research that defined the properties of gases and acids and a lot of stuff that really helped establish the science of chemistry. And this is before Benjamin Franklin and other people had done their work that took it further. But he was very, very important, and he was basically a product of the Hermetic Renaissance. And his philosophy, which we call vitalism, became the basis for the development of homeopathy. Even though Hahnemann did his best to distance himself from anything that sounded too much like alchemy and stuff like that, because at his time it was not an intelligent thing to associate yourself with, because by that time,
It's just dangerous.
yeah, it was. Now, at this time in history, we have the development of many, many ideas of what of a sage. We have many images you're familiar with. This is Apollonius of Tyana, who existed and did his work and his missionary work in the 1st century, just not long after the crucifixion of Jesus. He was contemporary with him. I have not put up the Initiatic Mysteries of Classical Antiquities seminar that deals with Apollonius of Tyana, but he was well known to medieval people and the Hermetic people, and the stories of his life were published and written and have been translated. So he was an idea of a sage, an idea of that there were some people who went beyond being just human, and they became God-men. They became superhuman. They became sages and adepts, people who had powers that other people didn't have through their knowledge and through their discipline. This is Debris' image of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus was considered to be a human being, and he was allegorically the patron saint of all sages who had become Hermetic sages. As you can see, this is very, very allegorical. Looks like some of the Masonic drawings and things. And here, yeah, Theos, God, deity. And of course, holding on the tip of his finger the understanding of astrology and the astrological world and so on. These other symbols are symbols for other occult parts of occult science. You might find, for example, you notice the Hermetic caduceus. Shakespeare's Tempest is a story about Prospero, who is a Hermetic sage, or he's a magus. And he, of course, when he's all done carrying out karmic and dharmic activities that are salvific for both his friends and his enemies, on his island, and when he's safe again with his daughter and they go back to reclaim his kingdom, he burns all of his magical books and vows never to use them again. But that was the kind of that wasn't really the view of the sage that many people had. But anyway, these are some of the images. At this time in history, we have the image of many sages and maguses. So, what actually occurs? Are there any real sages and maguses? Yes, there are. Michel Nostradamus. Nostradamus, he did very complicated horary astrology that was what we call mundane astrology, which has to do with what's coming to pass on the earth in different times. He drew the usual square horoscope, and he used psycho and Kabbalistic means to interpret it, and means of divination. He says, gathered at night in study deep, I sate, alone upon the tripod stool of brass. Exiguous flame came out of solitude, promise of magia that may be believed. We don't know exactly what he did, but he used a tripod, which is, you remember from the mysteries of antiquity, that the oracle at Delphi sat upon a tripod. Rabbi Theon, who was a great Kabbalist of the last century, who was a teacher of Madame Blavatsky and The lady who became known eventually as the Mother, who is the partner of Sri Aurobindo, Mira Alfasa. Rabbi Theon gave us a very interesting little occult statement. You may trust whatever you see in the violet flame. And that is actually a statement about meditation and some other things. He was from a converted Jewish family. They weren't converted, they were forced to become Christians, and so they changed their name from a Jewish name to a very Christian one, Our Lady, Nostradamus. So he was very steeped in Kabbalistic astrology and so on from his childhood. And scrying a bowl or cauldron, which is what he did to receive his many visions, was a growl form of divination from Druidic tradition. So that was also something that fed into what his knowledge was, things that he learned on journeys. He was a physician and a great healer in his time, and he used plant alchemy and Celtic pharmacology. His most famous remedy were his rose pills, his rose lozenges, which we'll show you. And the tripod stool was a method used by the Oracle at Delphi. And so I have a book called Prophecies Concerning the New Church that's online, where I've gone through the prophecies of Nostradamus, especially about the future of the spiritual future of mankind and what Swedenborg called the New Church. And so if you're interested, that's online. He may have been another model for the legendary Christian Rosenkreuz of the next century as well. So
Christian Rosenkreuz, another one of those mystical things that never was, or is that
he's a mystical thing that never was. He is he's the basis for Rosicrucianism, and that's what our next module is about. And so I'm just showing you how this sort of sets that up. So we're going to watch a little video now that gives us some nice some background about the childhood and the methods of Nostradamus.
Was born of a family of notaries and lawyers, people who were rather well-to-do. His grandfather, Pierre de Notre Dame, actually had changed the name of the family from Gassonet, a Jewish name, to Notre Dame, Our Lady, which couldn't be more Catholic and couldn't be more French.
The family changed its name to avoid persecution by the Inquisition that raged through Europe for over 300 years. In Provence, the Edict of 1501 was enacted by King Louis XII, instructing all Jews to be baptized.
In Nostradamus' time, the Inquisition was very active. And this made it very difficult for most people at the time, because if they did anything that was even suggestive of what the church didn't like, they could be killed, or they could have their land taken away and put into prison.
In spite of persecution, the 16th century was alive with the excitement of newly available knowledge in medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy. Young Michel de Notre Dame would find these studies intoxicating at a very early age.
It was one of his grandfathers, Jean de 7HERMb, who recognized a special talent within Nostradamus as a child. And he took him under his wing. He actually asked that the family allow him to come and have him live in his household. And he was probably taught in some of the ancient rites of Kabbalah, into some of the more mystical aspects of Jewish tradition.
We know he was given books of magic that he kept until he was an older man. So we think he was schooled in magic and in spells, incantations.
In addition to the rudiments of mathematics, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, his grandfather would give him his first taste of what were called the celestial sciences.
Hebrew tradition has a rich background dealing with astrology, dealing with the stars of heaven. So his grandfather would have been one that would have led him to look up into the heavens and to witness not only the stars as they are, but the stars as they can impel human consciousness and bring about the destiny of civilization.
From this early age, his grandfather would encourage the young boy to pursue a livelihood in the art of medicine.
As a physician, of course, he would have to study astrology. That was the first subject to be studied in medical practice. And I'm sure that the clear skies of Saint-Remy de Provence attracted his attention. I'm sure that his grandfather encouraged him.
Jupiter, being more joined to Venus than to the moon, appearing in white fullness, Venus hidden under the whiteness of Neptune, struck by Mars through the Milky Way. Michel de Nostradamus, 1555.
Nostradamus used lozenges that was composed of ground up not only the rose petals but also the rose hips, which contains the ascorbic acid, which is what we use today in vitamin C, which we know is something that fights infections.
When he was 52, Nostradamus wrote down the formula of his rose lozenges.
300 to 400 red roses, plucked before dawn, are pulverized and mixed with sawdust from the greenest cypress, iris of Florence, cloves, odorated calamus root, and linaloes. Nostradamus, 1555.
Little more is known of his remedy, but his cure rate was impressive. Some hold that another secret was a belief in cleanliness.
He was able to avoid contracting the plague himself because he practiced hygiene himself. And this is one thing that he insisted on, that for himself, before going into the patient, that he himself was clean as well as the patient themselves were clean.
Nostradamus, at the age of 30, Nostradamus was married. Strangely, his wife's name has been lost to history.
Nostradamus' first marriage bore him children. His wife was apparently very much beloved. It was a marriage of love rather than convenience. And unfortunately, while he was away, probably in Italy at the time, the plague swept through that particular part of Provence, and we returned to find that his entire family had fallen victim to the plague. He lost all of them.
Until this point in his life, Nostradamus was known only as a healer and an intellectual. But the death of his wife and children from the plague marked a time of deep introspection and personal change. In 1538, while Nostradamus was still living in the south of France, he was informed that officials of the Inquisition wanted to question him. Wisely, he chose to avoid them, and still mourning the loss of his family, he set out on a wanderlust throughout Europe and beyond. Some believe this was a period of psychic awakening.
One of the legends of Nostradamus's psychic abilities occurred when he was traveling in Italy. And he came upon a group of Italian monks, and to one of them he went up to and said, "Father."
The monk was a Franciscan called Felice Peretti. Nostradamus fell to his knees and paid homage to the lowly friar, explaining that he must kneel at the feet of His Holiness the Pope. Indeed, in 1585, the young monk became Pope Sixtus V, fulfilling the prediction of Nostradamus. Nostradamus did not stay in Italy, but chose to broaden his search for knowledge.
This was the time frame that he may have tapped back into his earlier childhood education of going to the ancient places of divination, the ancient mystery schools in Greece, in Turkey, and also particularly in Egypt. And we know that after, when he returned to France, he brought with him many of the different tools of divination.
But at night, the seer of Provence sat alone upstairs in his secret study and began to cultivate his famous visions of the future.
The wand in the hand is placed in the middle of the legs of the tripod. He sprinkles both the hem of his robes and his foot with water. A voice, fear. He trembles in his robes. Divine splendor. The gods sit down beside him. Nostradamus, 1555.
Most of the work that Nostradamus did in his divination, he did at night. And he lit candles throughout the upper floor of the room, which was his laboratory, you might say. And he filled the brass bowl with water. He then passed the wand over the bowl, and by moving a vibration across the surface of the water, this helped to open the veils of time.
Nostradamus wrote 1,000 quatrains, dividing them into 10 groups of 100 each, which he called centuries. He wrote in his native French, but to protect himself from the superstitious witch hunters of the day, he obscured the verse with Latin and Greek and even anagrams. The first edition of his Centuries was published in 1566 and continues to be published to this day. Nostradamus's predictions caught the attention of Catherine de' Medici, the reigning queen of France. Her interest in the occult and astrology was known throughout Europe.
After the first edition of Les Vraies Sorceries was released, she immediately summoned him to the French court. And while he was there, she commissioned him to do a prophetic reading on all of her children.
Nostradamus passed each of the queen's 7 sons by his magic mirror. Nostradamus pronounced that 4 of them would die, leaving only 3. History proved his prediction to be correct.
The 7 branches will be reduced to 3.
Nostradamus's 35th quatrain of the 1st century was immediately seized upon as suggesting that the reigning king of France, Henry II, would die in a jousting tournament.
The young lion will overcome the old one in single combat. In a cage of gold, his eyes will be put out. 2 wounds in one, then to die a cruel death.
The fatal accident occurred in the summer of 1559, as the king celebrated his daughter's wedding with a joust. He would ride against Count Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard.
They lined up on the lists. The horses galloped down, flinging sawdust and earth. There was stillness, thousands of eyes looking. There was a sudden crack, followed by thousands of gasping voices as they saw a huge splinter protruding out of the golden visor of the king's helmet. He fell to the ground, carried off, mortally wounded. The shaft had entered just behind his left eye, instantly blinding it, plunging deep into his brain. He suffered in agony for 10 days, slowly dying from infections. Every point of the prophecy came true. The young lion against the old lion. In fact, they were in a field of single combat. In other words, it is a tournament, a joust.
In a cage of gold, his eyes will be put out. 2 wounds in one, then to die a cruel death.
2 wounds made one. The eye is blinded, the brain is pierced. 2 wounds made one. And he was blinded as the splinter did plunge through the gold cage of his helmet.
So we have seen the influences that have come down from the Graal traditions through the Celtic and the Gallican churches and the Carolingian Reformation, and we've seen the development of the Hermetic Renaissance itself. And so the next module we're going to look at is a very important one that includes a lot of information on alchemy and other things. We're going to look at the development of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and that will be our next module.